Airline flights prove a flat, stationary Earth. I've made several videos on this specific topic, but I continue getting the same non-arguments ad nauseum, which have already been demolished by basic logic covered in several videos and experiments. I get pretty tired of manually typing out these very same proofs over and over and over again to each individual person who parrots the exact same non-arguments that I've shown to be irrelevant, because that's what they're told by others who believe the Earth is a spinning globe. This video was created to end this ridiculous discussion once and for all, with the selfish motivation of preventing myself from having to manually type out this information to each and every person who feels they've debunked the fact that westbound flights should be way shorter than eastbound flights if the Earth is actually a constantly spinning globe. The problem is, a westbound flight from New York to LA is often identical in duration to the return flight from LA to New York. There's no possible way for the flights to be even remotely similar on the spinning globe Earth, let alone identical in duration. So the arguments against this basic proof of a stationary Earth are pretty common. The first one is, the airplanes were spinning with the face of the Earth prior to takeoff, and therefore the airplanes will continue spinning with the face of the Earth for the duration of the journey, regardless of the direction of travel or altitude. In other words, the airplanes will never escape the rotational frame of reference only lent to them by the allegedly spinning Earth. The second argument is, well, the atmosphere is constantly spinning with the face of the Earth, so the planes are velcroed to the rotational frame of reference with the ground because the atmosphere is velcroed to the rotational frame of reference with the ground, even up to tens of thousands of feet or even many miles into the air. The third argument is the two flights are not identical. The eastbound flights are shorter than the westbound flights sometimes, so you're lying. Now, I've made several videos completely discrediting these arguments against the fact that the flights are often identical in duration, but it appears that people would like to debunk the flat Earth and are somehow incapable of watching videos or considering basic facts that happen to demolish their ludicrous position. So this video will be the last one I make, hopefully, proving this point conclusively once and for all. The first thing to point out is that most people will always think the Earth is a spinning globe, no matter what. So regardless of the proof that you show them, even if it conclusively demonstrates that the world is stationary, they will forever continue thinking that the Earth is a spinning globe, no matter what, so I must be stupid for proving it's not spinning. They'll go ask a physicist whether or not the Earth is spinning, or whether this proof I'm pointing to is valid, and of course the physicist will assert that I'm wrong because we all know the Earth is a spinning globe. That's apparently how modern science works. We must disregard basic observations and proof that are contrary to the doctrine of a spinning spherical Earth, which means the world will always be a spinning sphere to people who refuse to consider the truth. Regardless of the evidence presented, physicists will always maintain the position that the Earth is spinning. So let me give you an analogy real quick to illustrate this point and how ridiculous their position is. Let's say you believe in Santa Claus and so does your little brother. If you were to find your mother's handwriting on the to from information on presents from Santa, and you begin questioning whether Santa was real. Now, if you ask your little brother what he thought about Mom's handwriting on the to from information on a present from Santa, do you think your little brother is going to logically conclude that Santa is fake? Or would you expect them to make up some excuse to discredit this evidence and continue believing that Santa is real no matter what? I'm certain they would come up with some reason why Mom had to fill in the label on the presents because we all know Santa is real and maybe he's just not that great with writing. I don't know. But Mom and Dad would never lie about this, right? Not to mention, if Mom and Dad were Santa, then we'd have Christmas every day. That's the sort of illogic we have to deal with when we're talking about physicists who believe the Earth is a spinning globe no matter what. Okay, so this is a similar situation we have with asking a physicist how the two flights could have, identical duration or even similar duration on a spinning globe. They're going to assume the world is a spinning globe and construct some wild position and illogical rationality to show the flights would have identical duration even on a spinning globe, which is ridiculous. Okay, so the first thing we should do is demonstrate the problem I'm pointing to. I've done several videos covering this, this, but for some reason people refuse to watch them or refuse to consider the possibility that the world might actually be stationary. By the way, the only explanation for the flights being identical in duration is if the world is actually stationary, not spinning, not at any rate whatsoever, not to mention faster than sound near the equator, which it allegedly is. No matter how much you try to cram this observation with the two flights being identical to fit the spinning globe Earth model, you're just trying to find excuses why Santa is real. Seriously, it's a very good analogy. Okay, so to cover the first argument being the airplanes were spinning with the face of the Earth prior to takeoff, and therefore the airplanes continue spinning with the face of the Earth for the duration of the journey, this is the most ridiculous, pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-scientific argument designed by impossibly gullible people who wish to propagate the spinning globe Earth model no matter what. The first point to explain is the Coriolis effect. If you're not familiar with the Coriolis effect, it's a natural characteristic of objects attached to a rotating body fixed to such a rotational frame of reference. If you're on a merry-go-round holding a ball firmly in your hands, everything stuck to the merry-go-round is fixed to this rotational frame of reference so long as it's held fast to the rotating body. On a merry-go-round, a ball in your hands will certainly remain fixed to the rotational frame of reference so long as you hold it firmly in your hands. Now, if you let go of the ball and simply drop it, the ball will sort of keep its angular momentum, but will not retain its rotational frame of reference. If you drop the ball from a few feet up, it'll definitely land near your feet, but it would slightly slip out of that rotational frame of reference during its short fall to the ground. On the other hand, if you throw the ball up into the air or across the merry-go-round to someone standing opposite you, the ball will absolutely not remain fixed to that rotational frame of reference, spinning around the axis as it did when firmly held in your hands. In other words, if you throw the ball straight up, it will not continue spinning around the central axis and will immediately slip out of the rotating frame of reference, apparently traveling in the opposite direction as the rotating body. This is such a basic, obvious fact that's admitted by science. The Coriolis effect is actually used to prove the globe, believe it or not. So, if you observe cyclones, they will rotate in opposite directions depending on their position relative to the equator, or so it would seem. Actually, the dividing line between the clockwise and counterclockwise rotating cyclones is not fixed to the equator at all, but instead the dividing line between typhoons and hurricanes actually follows the circular path of the sun in its seasonal pass from Capricorn to Cancer. This is sort of besides the point, but the fact that the dividing line between the rotating weather patterns isn't fixed to the equator shows that the Coriolis effect is not responsible for the opposing rotational directions of typhoons versus hurricanes. Instead, the path of the sun, depending on the season, creates the dividing line or the dividing circle. In order to discard the flight times conundrum proving the stationary Earth, you must discard the Coriolis effect, which is a law of physics related to rotating bodies as a fixed frame of reference. The problem with that is globe earthers use the Coriolis effect to prove the rotating Earth, and you simply can't point to the Coriolis effect as proof of a spinning globe and ignore the Coriolis effect when it proves the world is stationary. The fact is, as the sun travels in circuits overhead, it acts as sort of a hot mixing spoon or an oar through the water, stirring up the atmosphere in a constant path around the center, North Pole, with the radius of the sun's path decreasing as it turns to the northern summer and increasing during the southern summer. Weather patterns north of the sun spin in one direction, while weather patterns south of the sun will spin in the opposite direction. The sun travels from Capricorn to Cancer during the course of 6 months, and then back during the course of the next 6 months, and the dividing line of rotating atmospheric patterns follows along with that circular path of the sun. Look at an oar propelling a canoe, or run a cupped hand through a bathtub full of water. You'll notice that the water on one side of your oar, or your hand, will rotate clockwise, and the water on the opposite side of the oar will rotate counterclockwise. This is a natural phenomenon of fluid dynamics, and the very same principle applies to the cyclones on Earth. Believe it or not, atmosphere behaves exactly like a liquid, only on a larger scale. If you consider that the sun itself is acting like an oar, perturbing the air away from the center of its path, it becomes very clearly obvious that the atmosphere south of the sun is rotating in the opposite direction as the atmosphere north of the sun. In other words, the Coriolis effect is not responsible for cyclones rotating in opposite directions, as that would have to be fixed to the equator, but instead, it's just the way liquids or atmosphere or gases behave when perturbed by an outside force cutting through the center of the medium. This is a very simple physical law of fluid dynamics, and it explains the opposing rotation of cyclones, and the fact that the dividing line is not fixed to the equator proves conclusively that the Coriolis effect is not the cause of opposing cyclonic rotation in reality. Now, with that being said, the Coriolis effect would necessarily apply to any object fixed to the ground, fixed to the rotational frame of reference, which is then released from the ground and propelled in any direction contrary to the circuit around the central axis of rotation. Not to confuse the issue here, but an airplane before takeoff could be considered as fixed to the rotational frame of reference as the ground below. However, the instant the plane leaves the ground and begins to propel itself west, for one example, the argument that the plane will never escape the eastward rotating frame of reference is absurd and totally anti-scientific. You must totally abandon the Coriolis effect as a natural phenomenon which applies to rotating objects as a fixed frame of reference to maintain this position. The simple fact is, once the airplane takes off, it would absolutely never remain fixed to the eastward velocity, which is only lent to it by the hypothetically rotating face of the Earth. As planes gain altitude and bank in different directions, it will further slip out of that fixed frame of reference attributed to the ground below. In the case of the westbound plane traveling in the opposite direction as the spin, it would certainly retain some of that eastward velocity for a very limited duration. Unfortunately for the spinning globe, once the plane leaves the ground and continues to propel itself west, it would constantly slip further and further out of that rotating frame of reference lent to it by the face of the Earth before takeoff, and this factor would increase as the plane ascends and accelerates in the opposite direction as the spin. As the plane accelerates, the ground below would continue spinning eastward around a curve, and the plane would be hauling ass in the opposite direction and could simply never remain fixed to the velocity relative to the ground below. In order to stop such a westbound plane, the pilot would have one hell of a time slowing back down to the exact eastward frame of reference attributed to the ground below, and would need to haul ass eastward just to attempt to return to the ground's velocity east, or return to that frame of reference. If you look at this flight, you'll notice that the pilot does all sorts of circles and loop-de-loops and barrel rolls into the air, meaning that any rotating frame of reference it might have possessed prior to takeoff is now completely lost. The ground below would necessarily be spinning at high velocities towards the east. However, the airborne plane simply would not be fixed to that frame of reference without a ton of calculations and contrary acceleration eastward to find its way back to that frame of reference. It would be nearly impossible, actually. When you see the plane do a nosedive, one thing that you'll notice is the ground below is totally stationary, much like the observations made from high-altitude weather balloons. This alone proves that the world is stationary, as airplanes absolutely do not have any sort of instrumentation or Pilot 101 calculations that would need to be figured in order to return to the frame of reference identical to the ground beneath. In order for a plane to do a nosedive above a stationary Earth, the plane would need to do all sorts of calculations and maneuvers in order to return to that fixed frame of reference matching that of the ground below, just to attempt landing the plane upon a stationary runway. Another set of controlled experiments that have been done multiple times involves lining up a cannon or an air rifle or really any sort of explosive projectile. Definitely don't try this sort of thing at home, but you can even do similar experiments with something that's not even dangerous at all. But anyway, so experiments have been done that involve lining up a cannon or an air rifle perfectly vertical. So you use a plumb line to make sure that the barrel is perfect. And on a still day, this has been done, multiple times under controlled conditions, and they even fired them all the cardinal directions, but including perfectly vertical. This is the one that really interested me. The ball would always fall within a couple of feet of the cannon that fired it, and in many cases it would land directly back into the barrel of the cannon that fired it. Now, the animation you're looking at here is obviously not to scale, and it's exaggerated in terms of speed, but it's to show a point. We know that physical law, if you were spinning an object, and again, it is going faster than sound at the equator, so that's a high velocity spin, regardless of how large the Earth is. That's a very fast motion. Now, if the cannonball within the barrel of the cannon is traveling, at the same speed as the ground before it's fired, I've said this before, but one of the laws of motion is an object in motion will maintain its velocity until enacted upon by some other force. And we can most certainly consider an explosion compressed in the barrel of a cannon or even in the barrel of a rifle. We can consider that some other force, absolutely, for sure. The other point to consider is the Coriolis effect. And again, that has to do with a rotating frame of reference, which is a lot different than a linear frame of reference. Of course, people argue that everything maintains its angular momentum forever. And that may be true if you're talking about tossing a ball into the air. But even if you do that from, say, the back of a pickup truck while it's moving 5 miles an hour, you'll certainly see that the ball will maintain its angular or forward momentum up to the point to where it reaches the pinnacle, and then it will just fall straight down to the ground without that forward momentum. If you toss the ball high enough, of course. And this has nothing to do with the wind. Send the truck at 5 miles an hour, so there's not going to be a whole lot of back pressure. But toss a tennis ball, say, as high as you can, or 10 feet into the air, as perfectly straight up as you can. Might take you a few tries, but if you throw that ball perfectly straight up, you'll see that it sort of, tags along with you on its way up. But then as soon as it equalizes in midair and then starts to head down, it's going to slip out of that forward momentum. Objects don't maintain their forward momentum forever. And so from your perspective in the moving truck, it's going to start going backwards, accelerating to a maximum of 5 miles an hour, according to you, because that's how fast you're going. So it's just a natural law of physics. And so that applies to the spinning Earth, and if you apply that to the spinning Earth, it disproves the spinning Earth. It shows that we're stationary. You can ask any artilleryman whether they, figure in the spin of the Earth when they fire artillery, and they'll look at you like you're crazy because they don't. When you fire artillery, you just figure in, the angle and how far you want it to go, and it'll go about that far, depending on topography and winds and stuff, but it'll go about that far in any direction. When in reality, regardless of winds, regardless of people arguing that the atmosphere keeps everything spinning at the same rate as the ground, is ridiculous because, of course, when you're at a higher elevation, if the Earth is a spinning globe, then you're going across a greater arc. You have to cover a greater distance just to stand still. So even if it continued traveling at the same speed as the ground, the more altitude you gain, the further and further you must go just to stand still relative to the ground, or to keep up with the ground and remain fixed to that, frame of reference in terms of a rotating velocity, which is impossible. And of course, the momentum that it has is only lent to it by the Earth. If a plane is propelling itself in the opposite direction as the spin, that wind would, it would definitely be one hell of a headwind, but the plane would be traveling at a higher relative speed to the ground when compared to an eastbound flight, just simply because that's how reality works. Objects traveling in opposite directions will have a higher relative speed, so therefore the flight from New York to LA would have to cover much less air time. It would have to fly less distance through the air to reach LA because they're racing towards each other, and that's regardless of how fast it is not spinning prior to takeoff. People who argue this point are just arguing for the globe and not thinking about it. The Coriolis effect clearly proves that objects or planes are objects, but objects that are fixed to a rotational frame of reference do not remain stuck to that rotational frame of reference if they're compelled in a direction contrary to that, axis of rotation. If they're not fixed to that rotating body any longer, they are not going to remain fixed to that rotational frame of reference, especially if you've got jet engines attached, and that's with the atmosphere spinning or not. But the simple fact is you don't see all westbound flights with massive, massive headwinds, and all eastbound flights don't get massive, massive tailwinds always as a rule. rule, which you'd have to see if the globe was spinning east and the atmosphere was sort of velcroed to the ground somehow, which really doesn't make any sense if you consider space as an infinite vacuum with nothing separating the atmosphere from this infinite vacuum but the mysterious, non-proven force of gravity. The heliocentric model really just falls apart under all scrutiny. It doesn't make any sense logically. And when you point to flights being identical in duration from these 2 points, east to west and west to east, when you point to experiments done involving firing cannons directly vertical into the sky and having the ball land directly into the barrel of the cannon that fired it, conclusively proves that the Earth isn't spinning. You can argue this, but if you try to support your argument with physical experiments, you're always going to lose, because the physical experiments we do here on the ground in reality in controlled conditions conclusively prove that the Earth is stationary. In order for a plane to do a nosedive above a stationary Earth, the plane would need to do all sorts of calculations and maneuvers in order to return to that fixed frame of reference matching that of the ground below, just to attempt landing the plane upon a stationary runway. The fact is, no matter how fast a plane travels east, west, north, or south, if the plane does a nosedive, the ground beneath will always be absolutely stationary every single time, no matter what. Now, in order for this to work on the spinning globe model, you would need to have instrumentation designed to help the pilot return to the eastward frame of reference as the runway, and pilots would need to do complex calculations every single time they land in order to return to that frame of reference matching that of the ground below. The argument entailing the flights retaining their eastward velocity regardless of the plane's velocity or altitude is so very ridiculous. I can't believe so many apparently intelligent people will maintain this totally illogical and disproven position. In terms of the eastbound flight, the same sort of argument applies. If the plane is traveling east with the ground prior to takeoff, for every second that it wastes energy ascending, banking, it would begin to slip out of that eastward frame of reference, and the race between the plane and the destination would begin. The simple fact is, the two flights are often identical in duration, which totally disproves the spinning Earth. Period. This doesn't have anything to do with the atmosphere spinning with the Earth either. So, when you explain this to a globe earther, they will scratch their head and assert that, well, since the atmosphere is spinning along with the face of the Earth, then that's what causes the planes to remain fixed to the frame of reference with the ground below. This is just as silly as the first argument against the flight times conundrum, to be honest. The first point against this argument is the higher in altitude you climb, the faster the atmosphere must travel to remain fixed with the ground below. So if the ground is traveling at 1,000 miles per hour near the equator, and the atmosphere near the ground is traveling at that same speed, we'll grant that for argument's sake, but the atmosphere at, say, 5 miles or 10 miles high would need to travel faster and faster east in order to retain its fixed position above the ground. This is because if the Earth is a globe spinning, when you gain altitude, you'd be traveling across a greater arc and would need to cover more space in the same amount of time to remain fixed above the ground below. High altitude flights would increase the apparent ground speed of westbound flights and would decrease the apparent ground speed of eastbound flights, further showing this argument is futile and pseudoscience. This is all besides the point because westbound flights do not experience constant headwinds matching the rate of the ground, nor do eastbound flights experience constant tailwinds matching the rate of the ground. Furthermore, what about the atmosphere, say 30 miles up into the air? We can view weather balloon footage that clearly shows the ground below as fixed, and it's not a globe. So what is causing weather balloons to travel faster and faster eastward as altitude is gained? Look at the footage of Felix Baumgartner's high-altitude skydive at 130,000 feet, and you'll clearly see that the ground beneath him is stationary even at those high altitudes. In other words, if the atmosphere is velcroed to the rate of spin near the ground, there's no possible way to retain that frame of reference if it's that high up. since it would need to accelerate faster and faster east as altitude is gained to remain fixed above the ground below. We can clearly see the ground beneath is stationary, and he's not traveling at a high velocity, apparently west, which he necessarily would be doing if he went straight up from the spinning ground below. Even if he was traveling at the same speed as the ground below, the higher up in altitude he gets, he should start slipping further and further west, since he's apparently traveling across a greater arc. Furthermore, if the atmosphere is fixed above the ground many, many miles into the air adjacent to the vacuum of outer space in the heliocentric model, what could possibly prevent the upper atmosphere from expanding to fill the infinite vacuum of space? You can't just say gravity and that solves it. You simply cannot have a body of gas adjacent to a vacuum without something separating the two. Now, I'm not saying there's a glass dome in the sky, but what I'm saying is that space is not an infinite vacuum. The fact that our atmosphere even exists disproves the globe-Earth heliocentric model, but even this is besides the point of the two flights. It's just another major reason why the heliocentric model is totally incorrect, and it shows how, regardless of altitude, the world isn't spinning, which it should be, even if the world was a spinning globe and the atmosphere is velcroed to the rotational frame of reference near the ground. That frame of reference, there's nothing to cause the atmosphere to spin faster and faster as altitude is gained to travel across a greater arc and remain fixed above the ground. The final point to debunk is the claim that the flights are not identical, and the eastbound flights are often faster than the westbound flights. Now, that may be true, however, that's exactly the opposite of what you'd expect if the Earth was spinning eastward. Look at the flight times from May of 2015. You'll see that the flight times are identical, which actually matches my real-world experience when flying from Florida to Texas and back. The two flights were indeed identical in duration, in reality, and I was totally confounded, even as a 10-year-old child, as to how this is even possible if the ground is spinning east about 800 miles per hour at that latitude. Just think about this for a minute. In order for the flights to be identical in duration, the world must be stationary. This has nothing to do with the atmosphere spinning. Airplanes are aerodynamic and compelled through the air by their own propulsion, which amounts to several jet engines attached to the plane. If you actually think that jet airplanes are strictly at the mercy of the winds and their independent propulsion cannot help them break free of their apparent eastward velocity prior to takeoff, you obviously haven't thought this through, and you're simply making excuses for the spinning globe Earth, which doesn't exist in reality. For one thing, airplanes traveling west will experience headwinds or tailwinds depending on the weather conditions. Eastbound flights will also experience headwinds or tailwinds depending on the weather conditions during the flight. In order for your hypothesis to work, then westbound flights would always experience immense, almost insurmountable headwinds. This just isn't true. It doesn't occur in reality. Eastbound flights would always enjoy a major tailwind, and that also isn't true in reality. In order for someone to justify the two flights being identical in duration, they must cast aside all common sense and physical laws. The simple fact is, if the planes are fixed to a common rotational frame of reference prior to takeoff, the law of physics known as the Coriolis effect must be rejected as false to maintain a spinning globe Earth model. Unfortunately, anyone can demonstrate the Coriolis effect, which is a law of physics related to rotating bodies as a fixed frame of reference. The Coriolis effect is not the cause of the opposite rotation of cyclones, but rather a simple principle of fluid dynamics where the sun acts as sort of an oar, disturbing or perturbing a liquid. The sun's stirring up the atmosphere, and the atmosphere reacts to this perturbation in opposite directions depending on the relative location to the path of the sun. Since the dividing line between typhoons and hurricanes is not fixed to the equator, then the Coriolis effect is no longer a valid explanation of this phenomenon. But the Coriolis effect is definitely a characteristic of a rotating body. The airline flights having identical duration is complete, irrefutable proof that the world is not spinning. With or without the atmosphere spinning, planes are designed to cut through atmosphere, especially with the advances in aerodynamics and jet propulsion. So now that I've made this video, please stop commenting on these three spinning globe arguments which have been conclusively debunked. The Earth isn't spinning. It's not a globe. East to west flight times prove this conclusively, whether you like it or understand it or not. You must at least consider the world as a stationary plane, just for, hypothetical, just for argument's sake, to see whether this is true. If you always consider the Earth as a spinning globe and fail to consider the Earth as anything but that, no matter what, no amount of evidence will register with you because you're totally brainwashed by illogical assertions of people who are incapable of seeing the plain, simple truth for what it is. The final point to make in regards to airline flights is the fact that pilots maintain a level flight in order to maintain a consistent altitude. If the Earth was actually a globe, a pilot would need to angle their nose down in order to maintain a consistent altitude. Technically, an airplane wouldn't even really need to ascend in order to gain altitude. All they'd need to do is fly level. By flying level, the path of travel would be a tangent to the curved ground below. If you observe a helicopter make a perfectly vertical ascent, or a rocket for that matter, such vertical flights remain fixed to the position below if they travel straight up vertically. In all actuality, if you travel straight up, you would necessarily begin to slip out of that eastward frame of reference of the ground below, simply because you would be traveling across a greater arc as you gain altitude, so the arc would be greater than that of the spinning ground. Any object thrown upwards from a moving body would apparently head backwards as it gains altitude, and would head very swiftly backwards at immense speeds on their way back down. This principle can be demonstrated without a rotational frame of reference. If you take a ball and toss it pretty high into the air, it will obviously come straight back down to you. However, if you're in motion, if you toss the ball upward, it will keep its forward momentum only up to the point where it starts to head back down, where it will lose all of its forward momentum and head straight back down, straight towards the ground, but from your moving frame of reference, it'll appear to head backwards. This shows that objects, when compelled high into the air, will maintain their forward momentum only to the point to where they reach the peak of their trajectory, at which point any forward momentum will be lost and they will just simply fall straight down. Since you continue moving forward, the ball will land behind you and will absolutely not continue their forward momentum on the way down. This is a demonstration that proves the flights would not maintain their eastward momentum, especially since they are propelled through the air with several jet engines. Imagine if the tennis ball in this experiment had jet engines attached that would propel them backwards from my course of travel. The ball would land even further behind me in that case. Globularists will maintain that the airplanes will keep their eastward velocity along with the face of the Earth when they're not connected to the ground, and they have engines propelling them in the opposite direction as the rate of travel of the face of the Earth, and they're gaining altitude, which means they would be traveling across a greater arc. When you take the time to actually consider the scientific data, the flights being identical in duration totally disproves the notion that the Earth is traveling at any rate whatsoever, let alone faster than the speed of sound near the equator. The identical flight times prove the world as stationary. If you can demonstrate the contrary, please do so. But to assert that I'm wrong without offering an explanation or demonstration or proof other than the three arguments I've just totally debunked, then please keep it to yourself because you do not have a viable position in this argument. Thank you.